Hello, welcome back to our amazing conference. Gosh, what a morning. I'm still amazed by the content, by the conversations. So hopefully everyone is taking advantage of these learning opportunities. Share, talk to your colleagues, make sure that people know about this amazing content. Welcome back, everyone. I would like to introduce now my colleague, Cathi Kim, the director of our investment program. She's the guru of secondary capital. So, Cathi.
Thank you so much, Pablo, and welcome everyone to this afternoon's general session, Socially Responsible Investors Advance Equality. As we look back on the growing inclusive and community development credit union movement, what really comes to mind is really the leadership and the commitment to justice and communities that our network of now more than 400 community development credit unions across the country have been leading the way when it comes to potential solutions in building an inclusive recovery, from originating billions of dollars directly into low income and communities of color when communities needed them the most. Really, we thank our movement, our members, for serving as real leaders and lights in this movement as we think about this inclusive recovery. But as we saw in the past year and a half, the issues of financial justice and the racial equity gap, this is not new, but these issues being highlighted in national media became recent news to many. And as Dr. Atiya Martin said at our conference yesterday, really the only way to ensure that financial systems are equitable is to be intentional. In the past year, more than $50 billion have been committed from different corporations in the private sector towards racial equity and social justice. This is a level of interest and commitments that we haven't seen before. And so we ask ourselves the question, how might we move these commitments into actual actions and accountability? And at Inclusiv, we've been thinking about how we might create transformational partnerships with our members and different investors to bring capital resources to the cooperative movement to increase economic and social equity, from developing the first ever impact fund through the Southern Equity Fund back in 2019, and working with different sectors from Kresge Foundation and Philanthropy to Prudential Financial, MetLife, Bank of America, and National Cooperative Bank to raising $45 million in secondary capital for credit unions, working to address financial inclusion and racial equity in the American South, to the Inclusive Racial Equity Grant Fund, which was launched last year, bringing more than $1 million in grant funds to 59 minority designated credit unions across the country. Really, we're able to do this and support minority credit unions advancing racial equity and building a more inclusive economy, thanks to the partnership and support of the Annie Casey Foundation, Bank of America, Capital One, Citibank, JP Morgan Chase, PNC, and Prudential, and others. And it's my pleasure to also share that with the Inclusive Racial Equity Investment Fund, which is focused on bringing more investment capital into credit unions that have this focus on serving communities of color and bridging the racial equity gap. We were able to raise now more than $18 million for this purpose. And thanks to the Robin Wood Johnson Foundation, clients of the Sustainability Group, and it's my pleasure to share, as you might have seen in our recent press releases, Comcast, who came in as Inclusiv's first corporate investor, Mercy Investment Services, PNC Bank, BBVA, and others who will be announced shortly. And really, as we think about this, we see this as a growing movement. And this is the focus of our conversation today, translating and developing transformational partnerships. As Aiko Bethia said, anti-racism work is never transactional. If we want it to be transformational, it has to be relational. And so it's my pleasure to be part of this conversation with this incredible panel of experts representing different industries. They have been tremendous partners and supporters of the community development and CDFI movement, and really inspiring, phenomenal women. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today. Berman, CEO of CNote, a tremendous advocate and supporter of the CDFI movement. Before launching CNote, Kat served as managing director of Charles Schwab, where she led a strategy division focused on the future of finance, incorporating behavioral economics and predictive analytics. She has a tremendous story and set of experiences, and I invite you to read more about her bio and story on our conference website. Next, we're also joined by Sarah Kay, Vice President of Inclusive Solutions at Prudential Financial. Sarah has decades of experience in leading strategic philanthropy and partnerships to help advance Prudential Financial's commitment to inclusive economic growth. Last, but definitely not least, Teresa Metzler, Executive Director of Corporate Treasury at Comcast, where she's worked for almost 20 years and has helped Comcast navigate everything from acquisition financing and derivatives to Treasury-related community development initiatives and investments. And she's also a board member, treasurer of Family Services of Montgomery County in Pennsylvania, and has tremendous experience working with nonprofits as well. So before we dive into the conversation, I did want to address just a few things. One, this is a conversation, and while it's virtual, we would love to hear from everyone. Please share your thoughts and drop questions into the chat box. If you have any technical difficulties, please email emsupport@advancednetlabs.org or click on the support bubble on the bottom right hand of your screen. And again, this was just a brief introduction, and we invite you to read more about our amazing speakers and their bios on our Inclusiv website. And so on that note, just want to dive right in and get to our conversation. Please tell us more about your racial equity and economic equity and investment journey. We would love to hear more about your organization's economic and racial equity work, and really tell us more about how it got started, some of your goals, and how your organizations are seeking to make a difference.
Great. Do you want me to go first?
Sure,
dive
Teresa,
right in.
if you could dive in, yeah.
Sure. So yeah, I mean, you mentioned that I work at the Treasury Department at Comcast, and for at least a couple decades, we have actually had an equity and inclusion initiative. It started first with some of our bond underwriting and using different bond underwriting banks that were out there, and then it moved to and every year since 2004, we've had a 364-day revolving credit facility. And that was all with MDI and CDFI banks. And this established a long-running relationship and a purpose to do this in a way that was always very important to Comcast. I would say, as 2020 came about and there was a lot of social unrest, it made us as a company look at what we were doing and ask ourselves, what else can we do? And that led us to Inclusiv and various other initiatives that we would like to continue and keep going, as time goes on.
Great. I can start or go after Teresa. Thank you, everyone, for having us on the panel. And I think for us, we are a 145-year-old company, so we are a long-standing institution. And, I love to start with the founding story of Prudential because we were founded on the premise that our founder, John Dryden, saw a social problem out there in the world that people didn't have the financial means to bury their loved ones. And so our first product was burial insurance. And so, we like to say that we were a social enterprise before even the term was coined 145 years ago. And that's been very much deep in the DNA of the company of really trying to understand what are the social challenges that the company can create solutions and services for, and then also invest capital, whether it be philanthropic or impact investments or private investments, to think about how do we drive equity and think about the ways that we can drive social and economic mobility. I would say, just like Teresa mentioned, if somebody had asked me 2 years ago, do you focus on racial equity work? I would have said 100%, because that's where our philanthropic and impact investment dollars go into low-income communities that are predominantly people of color. But we never took an intentional look at what does our portfolio exactly look like, and are all of the programs that we support or investments that we make really focused on this issue area. And so we took a journey over this last year to really say, how do we define racial equity and justice? What does that mean to us? And we've categorized it around dismantling systems and increasing access. We've taken a look back at what our, particularly on the philanthropic side, what our philanthropic support has funded over the last 40 years since the foundation had been created at Prudential. And so that was a really interesting exercise because we're about to cross the $1 billion mark sometime this month from the Prudential Foundation's philanthropic giving. And over 400 million of that is really focused on dismantling systems and increasing access specifically for Black and Latinx communities when we look back at our work. And so an exercise that we've taken both on the philanthropic and our impact investment side is to do a diversity scan. So we have pushed out a survey to all of our nonprofit and for-profit grantees and investees to really ask some questions around what does your staff makeup look like? What does your senior leadership look like? Your board? All of the questions, do you have diversity, equity, inclusion policies in place? To ask those questions to better understand where does our portfolio stand and where we want to move to in the future.
Hi there. Thank you so much again for having us, Cathi, and for this wonderful conversation. My name is Kat Berman, co-founder and CEO of CNote. My journey really took me here. I was, as you shared, managing director of a major financial services firm. And at the time, two major things were happening. I think one is really bearing witness to the wealth gap that is really now a wealth chasm happening across the United States. And seeing that I personally was not doing enough. Here I was creating a lot of financial products to make wealthy people wealthier. And yet we knew that finance could be a very powerful tool in terms of closing the racial wealth gap. At the same time, also witnessing the rise of impact investments as more and more large institutions, family offices, corporations were interested in putting the power of their balance sheet to work for good. And so I got to a point where I just couldn't stand by and watch this anymore. And so I left to start our social enterprise, CNote. So we are a woman-led social enterprise on a mission to close the wealth gap by supporting incredible mission-driven financial institutions like those on today's webinar, the incredible Inclusiv members. We do three things for CDFI credit unions. We bring technical assistance, impact reporting, and low-cost capital so that this tremendous group of institutions of CDFI credit unions, CDFI loan funds, CDFIs in general, can access the opportunity that is impact investors on their terms. And I think that's a really important piece. As you talked about racial justice and racial equity, we believe strongly in terms of changing and really questioning the power dynamic at play here and making sure that it is truly the community and the community institutions at work that are really dictating the future of what this means to drive economic development, economic prosperity, economic justice. And we incorporate that intentionality in everything we work. So we're very lucky to get to work with incredible corporations looking to do good in community with phenomenal credit unions like the Inclusiv membership base.
Thank you so much for sharing your stories. Just picking up on a few different threads that the three of you and your organizations have entered this movement and this work at different points in time, whether it's guided by over a century of history to being a leading, national private corporations to, Kat's story of entering from more traditional finance role, but coming in because of those questions and that call to purpose. I was wondering if you could also share, so you've developed different portfolios and are bringing in different partners and additional capital to support CDCUs doing this type of work. And you've been tremendously successful, but we know that progress is not linear. I also love that you shared that, as you're thinking about this work, the importance of listening to and putting communities first. That is so critical when it comes to equity, and instead of us coming in as investors saying this is how it should be done, but that you're listening and taking that moment to pause and ask questions. And so my question for the three of you are, you've been successful, but can you tell us more about what this journey actually entailed? Were there any challenges encountered? And what does it take to operationalize this mission or this call for racial equity? What does it mean for you and your teams in terms of operationalizing this work? So Kat, I don't know if you want to kick us off.
Sure. When I started this journey, I had been a fan of CDFIs for years, for over a decade. And so when I started CNote, my initial reaction was, how do we get more dollars going to CDFIs? In my work in traditional impact investing, I saw that there was very little money coming in towards CDFI bank, CDFI credit union, CDFI loan funds. And why is that? They are on the front line, as we all know, doing all this work really at the foundation of economic and racial justice. And one of the biggest challenges I found was education. So many of the impact investors that I was working with had never heard of CDFIs, nor did they know the tremendous impact they've been having for decades and a tremendous track record as well. So I think one challenge was definitely education. I think the other challenge was infrastructure. So when we started CNote, I interviewed friends in the CDFI industry across the country, and I said, what do you need? How do we better connect you to impact investors? What would be helpful for you? And many of them said the same thing, visibility and infrastructure. Many of them didn't have a budget to hire an impact investment associate or the Rolodex of all these great corporations to call. And yet it's such a huge opportunity because these are the institutions we need to be funding and we need to be supporting now more than ever. And so we heard that call, and that's really created kind of the basis of our work at CNote is how do we create that bridge so that any mission-driven credit union can access impact investors on their terms when they need it. But it was not without challenges. And I think education was the big one. And again, really seeing the need to build the infrastructure, the impact reporting system, and do it in a way that was accessible, right? Knowing that our credit union colleagues and partners didn't have a set budget or set, trajectory in place to really step into this new opportunity.
Yeah, I would just add, for Comcast, we have had, everyone thinks of Comcast as a cable internet company. And so our cable side of the business has had internet essentials for over 10 years now and has done very, very successful, providing children on lunch programs, internet. But from a corporate treasury perspective, we tried to look at our peers, in these groups and say, how are we also going to make a difference? The challenge came in that we didn't know what to do, right? We did have some history there with our banking group. We sought them out and asked them questions. What do they need? What do our community banks that we're already doing business with need? And we realized that, we looked at deposits and things, and deposits wasn't something that they wanted at that point in time. So then we're left with, well, what do we do now again? And so I think this goes to what Kat was saying about education. And if you're out there and you're needing capital or you're needing deposits, the corporates that may be there to give it to you don't know. They don't know where to start. And the organizations like CNote and Inclusiv provide a great opportunity for corporates such as ourselves to get involved with so that we can help all the CDCUs and CDFIs and MDIs like yourselves. And I think that the challenge for me was really where to start. And once I started going down that route, there's a lot of great support out there, and you just kind of have to grab it and embrace it once you see it.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of things. I agree with everything that Kat and Teresa have said. And I think, from our perspective, this work around racial equity and justice, I'll take it. I've been with Prudential now 10 years. And when I first started, we couldn't use the word equity in any of our investment memos or grant recommendations because it was a terminology that was still relatively, I don't want to call it taboo, but people didn't necessarily understand it, particularly at a financial services company. Equity means something very different than what we were trying to relay. And so to see the journey that we've taken now, where the company is fully committed to advancing racial equity, we've put out public commitments, we're making investments and grants in this space, is a really, nice arc of what the company's leadership went through. And so 100% I would agree on education and really helping people understand what are the issues and the challenges. I would say thinking about how you can leverage all of the capabilities that the company has. So that includes not only our financial capital, whether it be investments or grants, but also our human capital as well too. So we have a very robust pro bono program. We call it pro bono, obviously, because it's Prudential, but pro bono services to really think about how do we build up infrastructure, because I think that's always the, as Kat mentioned, really making sure that you have a strong organization that can, handle reporting out on data, because as a company, that's the one thing that the company is always going to ask for. What's the, the outcomes and the results that are being made in this space. And it's hard, right? Racial equity, it's not like we're going to solve it tomorrow, right? So you have to educate people on what are the short-term outcomes that we're going to see that are going to lead to the longer term, but also help people understand that it's a journey. It's not going to even happen in the next 3 to 5 years. And you have to make sure that people are keeping the eye on the ball during that period, because, we don't want this to be a phase where everybody is focused on this issue. And then suddenly in 2 years, it's like, what's the next thing that's going to come around?
Well, you hit on so many important points, and definitely there's a lot to think about. Sarah, I love your point about really, this is not going to get solved overnight. It took more than 400 years for these systems and for these gaps to develop, and it does require long-term commitments. And then also, while the four of us work with investments, really, when we're talking about equity, it's not just in terms of the financial sense, but as CDFIs and community development credit unions, it's the impact, the equity that we are seeking to build within our communities. And when we're talking about capital and assets, it's more than what's on our balance sheet. It's in a broader sense. And I appreciate how the three of you really touched upon that, whether it's human capital, the education piece, and building up the knowledge, because we don't have all the answers. Even, experts like the three of you, you don't have the answers. I think it allows the rest of us to also be vulnerable and say, hey, that's okay. We're not here to be right, but we're here to get it right. And we do that in partnership. So on that note, just want to transition a bit, just to kind of take a step back. The three of you and your organizations have been partners of Inclusiv and supporters of the CDCU and CDFI movement. And Kat touched upon this a bit earlier, but can you share with folks that are joining us for this conversation today a bit more about how you decided to work with Inclusiv and invest in community development credit unions? What are the opportunities or the impact, potential impact that you and your team saw in investing in community development credit unions, in advancing equity? And then also another theme to this panel today is really about transformational partnerships. What does that mean to you? So Teresa, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. When I first heard of Inclusiv, I was really intrigued by it. I was prompted with the deposit. This is what I think a lot of corporates get proposed to when looking at this in this arena, if you will. The Inclusiv team was telling me about the deposits, which was great. I love their program. And they just slightly mentioned this resilience fund and then said, but we'll get to that at some other time. I said, no, I'd like to hear a little bit more about what that fund was. And so they continued to talk about that. And it was all about the secondary capital. Coming from a Treasury background and knowing a very, very little, but enough amount about the capital ratios that affect banks and CDCUs. And I knew that the deposits were not the only avenue, and potentially capital and secondary capital can be more leverageable. And the Inclusiv team was educating me on that entire process. And the more and more I heard about it, the more and more it sounded like a very good fit for what we were looking for. We really wanted to make the dollars that we provided leverageable and usable, and that's what Inclusiv does. But I will say that if any of you are looking to do this to a corporation, looking to pitch any kind of capital, it will take some education. I had to sit down and actually do accounting T schedules to figure out how the debits increase the assets and how the capital ratio changes when you're adding in assets and deposits and when you add in capital. So I luckily am married to a husband who audits banks, so he was extremely helpful in that. But that analysis was exactly what I needed, and frankly, what I needed to take it up the chain in the company. People need to see how the deposits and equity and capital, whichever method you are proposing, how that affects you as a CDCU, and that will help propel. And that's exactly how we ended up working with Inclusiv, because every time I went back to them, they were more than willing to give me information. I asked probably the most silly questions, and Inclusiv was always welcome to answer my questions. And every time, and I just used everything that I got from them and was able to get this over the line, if you will, and very happy to. And I think that this was a better fit for us at this point in time because we saw a need there.
Thank you, Teresa. No, your questions were spot on. And I think we have to be bold enough and vulnerable enough to say, hey, can you explain this to me? Or I don't really understand that.
Yeah, as a corporate treasury, you have to understand that I don't deal banking all the time, and a lot of other treasuries don't. So I think, again, with the education piece, it's very important.
I'm happy to chime in here. So when we went on this journey, we knew that we wanted to support those organizations that were already on the front lines doing the great work. We had created infrastructure and technology years ago to support CDFI loan funds. And we started getting calls from credit unions going, I see you've done a really good job connecting loan funds to impact investors. How do you feel about working with us? And so as we started teasing out, all roads led to Inclusiv. I mean, it just became so clear that this was just the most amazing organization and body of individuals already working on working on these issues. Anyway, so when we started interviewing different members of Inclusiv and different CDCUs, and I think Cathi knows this because she's been on this journey with me, I just completely geeked out. I was so excited and so honored to get to be part of this community. So I have just complete reverence and appreciation and respect for the work that CDCUs do every single day, day in, day out, and the structure of credit unions. And I think that's what really drew me in, is credit unions are so different. And there's something so uniquely special and, in my opinion, transformational about the way credit unions, their structures, and the work of CDCUs. And so for me, it was just a no-brainer, frankly, to want to work with this incredible industry and with Inclusiv. And I would also say Inclusiv is so much more. I think I've just been tremendously impressed again and again of all the different ways Inclusiv supports its members, from what Teresa was talking about of innovative secondary capital initiatives, educational platforms, I mean, on and on and on. So I am again and again impressed with Inclusiv and this organization. And so for us at CNote, it was absolutely, I think, a delight and a privilege, frankly, to get to work together on this and say, okay, how do we build this out so that these members get the best of what impact investment is delivering? And as Cathi said beautifully, there's over $50 billion on the table already. Corporate investors, awesome folks like Teresa and Sarah, have already pledged over $50 billion in a year. Where are we going from here? And we're only going up. And so to be able to be thoughtful about how do we welcome those dollars in a way that works for credit unions, in a way that actually drives responsible growth, in a way that actually moves the needle on racial justice. Again, for us, it is an absolute pleasure to get to do this. And one last thing I'll say is, I'll also just echo Teresa's statement about it is also knowing that this impact investment opportunity is bigger than just deposits, right? So I welcome folks, as you're thinking about working with corporations, please know that they are able to bring deposits and secondary capital and visibility and new membership and ... So we encourage folks to get involved, and we're happy to share more about the different ways that employers are stepping in right now. But it really is a huge, I think, opportunity to showcase the amazing work and get, frankly, mission-driven capital for the amazing work that Inclusiv members are already doing.
Thanks so much, Kat. And Sarah, I mean, Prudential, Recently you all were successful in investing more than $1 billion into impact and investment related, opportunities, including Inclusiv. And with Prudential Financial, you've invested in a few different initiatives with Inclusiv. So I was wondering, can you tell us more from your experience and with Prudential, how you all decided to work with Inclusiv and support community development credit unions?
Definitely. And just one tweak to what you said, we've invested over 2.6 billion, I think, at this time over the lifetime of the impact investment program, but we currently manage a $1 billion AUM portfolio in impact investments, of which Inclusiv is one of our partners. And so going back to what I said previously on how we think about leveraging all capital, all sources of capital. So recently we invested $9 million in the Southern Equity Fund, which provides secondary capital, of which Teresa just went through about how important that is to credit unions. And so we're really excited about that investment and how that's helped catalyze this racial equity fund as well too, and more within your organization. And then we've also provided over $3 million in grant support to the organization as well too, to help build up the capacity and infrastructure. And over these last couple of years, it's really been focused on building up your digital platform and thinking about how you provide services, whether it be banking or lending and savings on the digital side, expanding your financial coaching programs. And then also once the hurricane had hit in Puerto Rico a couple of years ago, we had worked with you all in addition to build up the cooperatives in Puerto Rico and really help distribute dollars into the communities. And so similar to what Kat and Teresa said, it feels like this is like the Inclusiv fan club, right? It's really talking about the important and critical role that you all play as an intermediary for credit unions, because we don't do direct investments into credit unions. And so this is the way that we're able to get capital out and really make sure that you are providing the support, whether it's actually financial capital, but also services, as Kat and Teresa mentioned, the education that you're providing, the back office operations support that you're providing, and helping people apply for federal capital, and all of the things, all of the great services that you do provide, I think is so incredibly important. And for us to think about it in both perspectives of helping you build up your organizational capacity to actually get out the dollars to the credit unions.
Thank you so much for that, Sarah. And just following up on that and, a few other notes that Teresa and Kat shared, do you have any, so Prudential Financial does not directly invest in CDCUs, but the three of you have collectively decades of experience in looking at different pitch decks for, private investments to funding and grant proposals. Can you share some practical insights for the credit unions on the line with us today as they consider really some of the growth opportunities here for their different impact initiatives? Can you share some practical wisdom for them as they consider cultivating relationships and engaging with this growing circles of investors and potential partners? What have you seen credit unions do well? And then also, where can we do better? Help us understand maybe a bit more about, where investors are putting in capital and how you all are thinking of these types of investments and partnerships. Kat, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Yeah, I think one probably big note I would say, or kind of best practice, is that first really kind of understanding what all the opportunities are. One of the first things we do with our credit union partners is just really try to understand where are they going and what does growth look like for them? What does new membership look like? What does asset growth look like? What are the challenges? And then trying to really align that with what corporate investors are looking to fund, whether it's philanthropic, secondary capital through Inclusiv, deposits or whatnot. So I think one is just knowing the different opportunities that might align with you today is certainly one big one, I would say. I think second is the power of storytelling. I am blown away every time I'm on the phone with my credit union partners. The stories, the community involvement is tremendous. And yet oftentimes, when you go to one's website or you visit a financial statement, you don't always see that happen. So one of the main things that we've moved forward on at CNote is to really help our credit union partners with impact reporting. And it's something we're doing part and parcel with Inclusiv, because it's so critical that this new wave of investors understand the real difference you're making and that we do it without putting more burden on you. Because I think where we don't want to go is unlock this group of investors and suddenly every credit union has to hire a new director or add hundreds of $1,000s to their annual budget. And so really solving for impact reporting in a way that is not a burden on inclusive members is a really big win, I think, for all of us. So exploring those opportunities, and no, you don't have to go at it alone. We are working hard together to solve for this. So please know you don't have to go at it alone. I think is the second, but being open to telling your stories. And then third, I would say, and something that I'm really excited about is just stepping into this next chapter of growth, really thinking about how can these types of mission-driven dollars really fuel your future growth. And I think that's been really exciting to tease out with some of our partners, because many of them were doing broker deposits, or many of them, had really innovative products, but had no idea where they were going to get the capital, or frankly, invest in technology. So I do invite folks to see this new wave of corporate investments and impact investors as an opportunity. And then really it's about exploring what works for you, right? What works for you, what works for your CDCU, and kind of, taking that first couple steps into it.
I can add to that. First, I would actually say, if you're looking to get a corporate or a large corporate involved, I would actually say go local. Go to your local branch, or Comcast is very customer service, so I know we have local. Maybe that's not always the case, but I know you can also go to your government as well. Your local community can also guide you to which corporates have a local representative in that area that you can establish a relationship with. And the reason I say this is because, at Comcast, we are a global company at this point, but I have people in the field telling me all the time, hey, I have this local bank, CDCU, or anything out here that we would like to do something with. We have this idea and we want to grow our relationship with them. So if you establish that local relationship, that may spawn a relationship with corporate, because I know that's an avenue that we have used within our company. The other thing I would say is, if you do get to a corporate level, or even just with your local level, keep that going. Don't just, even if it doesn't work out this one time, I would say keep an annual visit every year and just say, hey, I just wanted to tell you what's new, what I'm doing. Because while it may not fit one year, it may fit the next year. And so just establishing a contact and trying to keep that going on a regular basis, and something may work out. The other thing I would say, and this goes on top of what Kat was saying, but having a clear statement as to what you intend to do with those funds is very important. It's difficult to say, oh, they just need, X amount of deposits or X amount of secondary capital. It's very nice to have a presentation or something to support that corporate person or that business can say to their colleagues, this is what they're going to do with these funds, and we're going to keep track of that. Have a way to keep track, and I see that as a really beneficial aspect, and that's what Inclusiv did. And I would say that a few of the banks that we do have deposits with have done very similar things. And so I think that following that path and getting local, I know you're local already. This is a local venture, but don't feel like you can't contact your big company local representative, because I think that it's really important to do that. And a lot of companies right now have this is a focus of theirs. So I think you would be received very well by doing so.
Yeah, and just to add to those points, I think, we don't make direct investments into CDCUs. We do into CDFIs. We have an $86 million portfolio right now of CDFIs. But I think in general, really being able to capitalize on this moment right now, where everybody is focused on closing the racial wealth gap, advancing racial equity, and credit unions are central to that, right? You guys know the customers the best. You are dealing one-on-one with these individuals, and being able to capitalize on the storytelling and the impact really say, as a result of, this number of loans, these many people have saved an extra X amount of dollars that got them to the next level around financial security, mobility, and ultimately prosperity. And so I think really thinking about how the storytelling and the impact data can be really powerful. And then I think what credit unions have always done a great job, and this is actually the primary role of Inclusiv, is bringing partnerships together, right? Even though we can't do direct investments into credit unions, we can do Inclusiv, we can do other CDFIs who do funnel the capital through. And so how do you bridge partnerships and innovations collectively together? And so you're also sharing the burden, right? It's not individually, everybody has to go and fundraise on their own, but really leveraging each other's expertise and the ability to come as a network.
Terrific points. And you shared so much wisdom and really practical steps and considerations as our movement continues to grow. And our vision for this work, yes, there's tremendous interest and support, but really it's also not without challenges, especially given the times that we're in now. But what I'm hearing from the three of you is that it's also an opportunity for us as a movement to be bolder, right? And in knowing ourselves, our community, our needs, knowing what the gaps are and really having a vision. What is our capital plan? Knowing and being able to tell our story as an institution and the communities that we serve, but also the impact, the vision, what we want to achieve with this capital. Also the fact that, and Teresa, I love how you really raised this a few different times, but it's about the relationships, go local. And someone put into the chat, looking at, who's there, including, academic institutions, but really it's about the relationships as well. The first talk is not always, or the first pitch doesn't, it's like a relationship when you're dating. You're not going to hit it off always on the first date. Sometimes flags will come up, right? But really, you've got to sustain that relationship. It's not just about a transaction or one single deposit or investment, but the overall arc. And if we see our work as financial institutions, but then also as community development credit unions, really looking at the impact we're trying to have on this shift in ethos and the larger sort of ecosphere and ecosystems of communities and people that we desire to serve. Definitely a lot to think about. So thank you so much for your insights there. So picking up on that, really, I think that brings us to the fact that we are at this watershed moment, as the three of you have, articulated so clearly. But how do we make sure that this is not just a moment, we shift this and it's a sustainable movement? We mentioned that there are more than $50 billion in corporate commitments. I'm sure there are others, but there's at least $50 billion that have been committed in the past year. But how do we strengthen also accountability and sustain this momentum beyond this moment? Can you share with folks on the line today, maybe even from your own experiences, what you and your teams are doing or questions that you're considering as we think about, the longer term sort of goals and vision for this work?
I can start. I think for us, our purpose is about closing the financial divide. I think over the last, 18 months, we've been really focused on saying closing the racial wealth gap, right? And so it's making sure that the strategies, the values, the approaches are embedded and integrated into our overall work. And so when this watershed moment hopefully doesn't pass, but if it were to ever pass, right, it's already embedded into the way that we're thinking about it and the way that we're viewing our partners, whether they be nonprofit credit unions or for-profit institutions. And so I think that's one way to ensure that. I think getting better at impact measurement and metrics, it's always kind of like a field that's just really hard at times, right? I always liken it to the fact that even ESG, there's like 1,000 metrics out there and nobody can agree on the one proper set. But it's really important to hold corporations and institutions accountable for the commitments that they've made. And I think organizations like Just Capital and PolicyLink are trying to create corporate racial equity standards to hold companies accountable for them. And then I also think just really making sure that it's the way that almost like changing the public narrative and making sure that it's front and center with how we're all talking about the work, right? It can't just be the corporations, it can't just be the credit unions, it can't just be nonprofit organizations, but creating that common shared narrative and goals around thinking about how to make sure that this is something that does not move away from the moment, but there are also that capital is a lot of capital is invested in this work. And so that, and then also on the policy side, right? Like that's, you kind of have the cover if you have policy changes that, you know, we saw a lot during a lot of the recovery and stimulus packages that came in through Congress over the last 18 months. And how do we sustain all of that going forward?
Yeah, I would add that, you know, while I think it is important for the organization, the CDCUs, the MDIs, the CDFIs, Inclusiv, the intermediaries, and CNote to stay involved, I actually think a lot of the responsibility falls on corporates to maintain this desire to have equity and inclusion. And I'll tell you that a lot of this is coming from employee base as well. So you have leadership driving this and accepting it, but you also have a lot of employees saying, look, we want our company to be socially responsible. And I think that momentum is actually harder to die out. I think this is going to keep coming because generation after generation is going to see that and expect more, which is great. And so I see the momentum continuing, but I do feel like it's people that are in the corporates have to allow it to continue. You know, not every employee is a decision maker. So the employees can move those leaders, but I do think that a lot of it falls on corporates to continue to do that. And, you know, individuals at these corporations that are heading this up, I think it's great work. I applaud all of the efforts that are being done in many different capacities. I am just looking, you know, I'm in Treasury, which is a very niched group and have a small impact, but as long as everybody takes that step and tries to keep maintaining it at every opportunity, say, what can I do? Can I do something that's socially responsible here? Then try to take that step. I mean, that just seems like the right thing to do. And that's how you keep the momentum going. And so, you know, that's where I would end, but.
I just want to say how much I love everything Teresa just said. So plus. I would just say add three quick things. One is I think we have such an opportunity to meet the moment. I know most folks listening have heard about ESIP, have applied to ESIP, are waiting to hear about. This is a tremendous opportunity for our industry. And so I think seeing impact investors as a opportunity as it relates to ESIP. Again, I think it's just a huge opportunity to welcome these new investors as we think about with ESIP funding, how do we get a new base of deposits? How do we prove out deep impact? These are all the things we want to be helping with. And so I think one is really meeting the moment with the incredible, dollars coming from government right now, and the credit unions that 100% deserve that opportunity to grow in that way. So I think meeting the moment and seeing impact investors as a part of that next experience. I think second is institutionalizing it from the CDCU perspective, really having the opportunity to build right now. I think it's an exciting build phase in terms of how do we build that infrastructure to bring in this new channel of capital in a way, again, that works for CDCUs. And then lastly, to Teresa's point, how do we institutionalize this at the corporate level? And this is where we spend a lot of our time at CNote, because it has to be more than a press release. It has to be more than a one-time, hey, we did it, check the box, my corporation cares about racial justice. Teresa's point, it is in how do we make this a part of business as usual? And so this is a lot of the conversations we have with our corporate partners, is institutionalizing this so that it literally becomes the future of business to have CDCUs on their balance sheet, period. This is where we're going. But I think it's that commitment, and that commitment, to Teresa's point, happens all across the organization, not just at the high levels. There's a groundswell of support happening at the employee level, and one that we can all really, gather around and create opportunity around.
These three incredible women just dropping a lot of knowledge right now. And yes, while the three of us work, with investments and capital, just noting that this really needs to be incorporated and integrated throughout the enterprise. And yes, you need executive support and the support of leadership, but if we're really talking about making investments to advance equity, those same principles and values need to be practiced within our own organizations. And Teresa, you're sharing your experience of how different, employee resource groups have also been active voices there. But then also making sure that sometimes, when it comes to this work, whether intentional or because this is new to so many of us, there sometimes are, unintended consequences where the bulk of the labor then gets shifted upon the shoulders of BIPOC folks. And by making sure that this is holistic and integrated into different aspects of the organization, so it's not just otherized, that is really key to making sure that we can sustain this work beyond this moment. Another question for the three of you is, we see this as a call, not just to be reactive, but to think more boldly and to think of this from a growth perspective. If we had the capital, what would be possible instead of coming from a deficit sort of, or constraint sort of approach? But at this moment, and this is a question that I also get from some of our members, but sometimes there is a difference, right, between what investor interests may be, and it's important to keep that in mind, as you all shared earlier, versus the needs on the ground, or what credit unions might currently perceive to be the needs and their capital position. Can you share some practical insights on how to respond when there are these differences? What can credit unions do? Because we see it's a tremendous opportunity, but sometimes there's this disconnect. What are your thoughts on that as an investor, or from your experience in working with different CDFIs and credit unions?
Yeah, I'm happy to chime in briefly. So the stance that we typically take at CNote is education, and sometimes it's just not a fit. We have had quite a few corporations have absolutely outrageous demands, and our front line is, look, that is not going to serve the communities that you're looking to serve. That is not impact. So while this may sound good in a boardroom, while this may be something you'd love to have in a press release, for us, our guidance comes from the community organizations. And when a CDCU tells me that's not helpful, when a CDCU tells me that is not going to move the needle in my community, or that capital's not helpful, or that deposit's actually harmful, we listen and we translate back to the corporation. Now, then it's really up to the corporation to say what they want to do. So if there's a place to meet in the middle, and usually there is, because usually a lot of corporations we work with are amazing folks like on this call that actually want to see this impactful. They don't want just the press release. They actually want to make sure that these dollars are going to something meaningful. And so when we make suggestions and say, this is actually what our partner is looking for, 9 times out of 10, they're like, yeah, let's try that. So I will say it's a wonderful environment for education and for presenting new ideas. But to your point, Cathi, it often starts with a kind of, hey, we think this matters, or hey, isn't this a good idea? And it's the importance of, again, putting the power and the voice back into it really starts with the community and what's going to be most beneficial to drive change and drive prosperity there, making sure that corporation hears that, understands that, gets the data, because to be fair, without data, how would they know? This is not, for many of them, it's not their day job. So not fair to them to expect to suddenly know everything about community finance. So really bringing that intelligence, that data, and those options. And like I said, 9 times out of 10, we're seeing amazing corporate partners say, yes, let's do that instead.
Terrific. Thank you so much for that. Clearly, this conversation needs to be continued, and we thank the three of you and your team so much for your partnership and support of this movement. We're at time, but let's continue this conversation. We hope to see you at future sessions as well. I'm going to now pass it back to my colleague, Jules, who's going to help us segue into the next part of the conference. But really, thank you once again for just such a thought-provoking conversation, and also inspiring us and sharing some practical insights on where we can go from here, and really envisioning what more equitable communities and transformational partnerships can look like. Thank you.
Thank you, Cathi. And thank you to this session's speakers, Kat Berman, Teresa Metzler, and Sarah Kay. After this session, beginning at 2:15 p.m., we'll have 3 breakout sessions: Inclusive Funds, Secondary Capital, and TA; Small and MDI Credit Unions Leverage Capital to Grow; and the third is Measuring Financial Well-Being. You can choose to go to one or drop in on all of them. If you don't happen to catch one, we'll be tweeting, as always, big ideas and sharing thoughts through the hashtag CDCUCon 2021. And the recording of all sessions will be posted online on YouTube at Inclusive CU Network channel and they'll be up by October 11th. Please be sure during the break to visit the exhibitor booths. As you know, these leaders in financial services are sharing their work in advancing financial inclusion, and we'd love for you to check them out. Also, at 3:30, after the breakout sessions, please join us for the conference's closing general session, advocating for low-income communities. We're really excited to have Senator Mark Warner, Democrat from Virginia, joining us for a conversation on bipartisan support of financial inclusion. Enjoy the break, and we'll see you back at 2:15 for the breakout sessions. Take care.